They say money can't buy class. But my daughter-in-law thought otherwise. She walked into my home with a smirk, polished nails, diamond earrings, and eyes that saw everything I didn't have. At first, I smiled. I'd seen her type before, the kind who mistake luxury for love and inheritance for intelligence. She told everyone her parents were well connected, that they could buy anything they wanted. But what she didn't know was that sometimes power doesn't shout, it whispers through the right people. And one of those people happened to be my lawyer. When she finally met him, her smile faded faster than her perfume. Because behind every quiet mother, there's a story waiting to be signed. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the Old Folks channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far our stories travel. Alina had grown bolder. She began inviting her friends to my home, showing it off as if it were her property. "It's old-fashioned," she would laugh, "but I'll fix it soon." I pretended not to hear, serving tea with my trembling hands. Her friends giggled, their perfume thick and artificial. My son joined in, unaware of how deep the knife had gone. That night, as she walked past me in the hallway, she whispered, "You know, maybe you should move in with your relatives. It would be easier for everyone." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were sharp. I paused, my breath catching for a moment. "Easier for whom, dear?" I asked softly. She smiled. "For the future." Then she walked away, heels echoing down the hall. I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the portrait of my husband above the fireplace. "She doesn't know what this house means," I murmured. The rain outside began to fall harder, streaking the window glass. My husband's voice echoed in my memory, "If anything ever happens, Idris will know what to do." That night, I wrote a letter. A quiet storm was beginning. The next morning, I visited an old office downtown. The sign read, "Idris and Company. Legal Consultancy." Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. Mr. Idris, now gray-haired but sharp as ever, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Rahman," he said, "I was wondering when you'd come." We sat in his office as he opened a dusty file. Inside were documents my husband had signed years ago, property rights, inheritance terms, and a private trust. My name was on every page. "Your late husband was wise," he said. "He knew someday this might be needed." I nodded slowly. The faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence between us. Before leaving, I looked out the window at the city skyline. "It's time to make some changes," I said softly. Mr. Idris smiled knowingly. "Shall I prepare the new papers?" I turned back toward him. "Yes. Let's begin." Outside, the clouds shifted, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. The next morning, I visited an old office downtown. The sign read, "Idris and Company. Legal Consultancy." Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. Mr. Idris, now gray-haired but sharp as ever, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Rahman," he said, "I was wondering when you'd come." We sat in his office as he opened a dusty file. Inside were documents my husband had signed years ago, property rights, inheritance terms, and a private trust. My name was on every page. "Your late husband was wise," he said. "He knew someday this might be needed." I nodded slowly. The faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence between us. Before leaving, I looked out the window at the city skyline. "It's time to make some changes," I said softly. Mr. Idris smiled knowingly. "Shall I prepare the new papers?" I turned back toward him. "Yes. Let's begin." Outside, the clouds shifted, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. The next morning, I visited an old office downtown. The sign read, "Idris and Company. Legal Consultancy." Inside, the air smelled of paper and coffee. Mr. Idris, now gray-haired but sharp as ever, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Rahman," he said, "I was wondering when you'd come." We sat in his office as he opened a dusty file. Inside were documents my husband had signed years ago, property rights, inheritance terms, and a private trust. My name was on every page. Your late husband was wise, he said. He knew someday this might be needed. I nodded slowly. The faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence between us. Before leaving, I looked out the window at the city skyline. It's time to make some changes, I said softly. Mr. Idris smiled knowingly. Shall I prepare the new papers? I turned back toward him. Yes. Let's begin. Outside, the clouds shifted, and for the first time in months, I felt peace. After lunch, she reached into her handbag and placed a simple brown envelope on the table. The sound it made was small but heavy. I believe this is what you're referring to, she said, her tone gentle yet final. Her son frowned. What's this? Why don't you open it, she replied. As the flap tore open, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a low, steady drumbeat of fate. Truth unfolds. He pulled out the deed, scanned it, and froze. His face paled. The name printed on the ownership line wasn't his, or hers, it was his mother's. Mom, I don't understand. Her eyes met his calmly. It's my house, she said softly. Always has been. You just didn't bother to check who bought it. The room went silent, heavy as stone. The daughter-in-law's spoon clattered onto her plate. The air itself seemed to stop moving. The collapse. The daughter-in-law's face flushed with disbelief. You can't do this, she snapped, standing abruptly. Oh, my dear, the mother replied, her voice smooth as glass, I already did. Her son looked between them, guilt, shame, and realization flooding his eyes. For the first time, he truly saw his mother, not as weak, not as old, but as unbreakable. The silence that followed was her victory. Quiet, complete, and deserved. A week later, the moving truck arrived. No shouting, no confrontation, just quiet defeat. Her son and his wife packed in silence, their pride deflated like old balloons. She stood by the gate, watching them leave. The wind carried away the last trace of their perfume, the echo of their heels, the memory of their arrogance. For the first time in months, the house breathed freely. The restoration. She moved through the house slowly, touching walls, dusting shelves, reopening old curtains. The sunlight returned like an old friend. She lit the fireplace, the warm glow wrapping around her like comfort. The ticking clock resumed its steady rhythm, not of endings, but beginnings. The house wasn't empty anymore. It was alive again, because she was home. The reflection. On the mantel, she found an old photograph, her son as a child, holding her hand. She placed it carefully near the firelight. Forgiveness takes time, she murmured. But this house will always have room for it. Her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from peace. A single tear slid down her cheek, soft, but no longer from pain. That night, she sat at her desk, writing slowly under the yellow lamp glow. My dear son, she began, what you did hurt me deeply, but losing you would hurt even more. Each word felt like a small piece of healing stitched into paper. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and sealed it with calm hands. Outside, the rain began to fall again, gentle, cleansing, forgiving. The weight. She mailed the letter the next morning. No calls, no messages, just silence. Weeks passed. Then one morning, a soft knock came at the door. The mailman handed her a small white envelope. Inside were just 4 words, written in her son's familiar handwriting. I'm sorry, Mom. Soon. Her fingers trembled as she smiled through tears. Maybe some wounds do heal. The visit. Months later, they returned. No fancy clothes, no arrogance, just quiet eyes and hesitant smiles. Her son hugged her first, tightly, without words. The daughter-in-law stood behind him, softer now, eyes lowered. They ate dinner together in peace. No boasting, no pride. Just family. Sometimes, revenge doesn't need cruelty. Sometimes, it just needs truth. That evening, she sat by the fire, the glow wrapping around her like a promise kept. The warmth felt different, not from the flames, but from closure. She watched the shadows dance across the room, every flicker whispering, "It's over." The promise. On the wall hung the framed deed, proof of patience, not power. Her husband's photograph caught the firelight, his faint smile reflected in the glass. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "They understand now." For a moment, it felt like he was there, nodding in silent pride. The last word. Outside, the rain fell softly, cleansing the world beyond the windows. She closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of home, old wood, warm fire, and peace. The story had ended not in victory or defeat, but in balance. Her last thought drifted into the night like a prayer. Never underestimate a mother who's been told she's no longer needed. The rain had just stopped when she arrived. The air smelled of wet earth and rose petals as the car door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked out of a magazine cover. Her heels clicked sharply on the driveway stones, competent, deliberate. I stood by the old wooden door, watching her eyes scan my home with faint disapproval. The lace curtains, the chipped vase, the faint scent of old wood, everything seemed to offend her. My son held her hand proudly, like she was the crown jewel of his life. "Mother," he said softly, "this is Alina." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hides judgment behind charm. I welcomed her with open arms, but inside, something felt cold. That evening, the dinner table was heavy with silence. The only sound was the gentle clinking of silverware. Alina spoke of her parents' beach house in Dubai, of their investments, of how real wealth meant freedom. I listened quietly, spooning soup into my bowl. My son laughed at every word she said, as if her stories were proof of success. At one point, she glanced around and said, "It's cozy here. Like a museum of old things." I smiled politely, pretending not to hear the sting. The wind outside brushed against the windows, whispering something I couldn't name. Later that night, when everyone had gone to bed, I sat in the dim kitchen light, staring at the empty plates. Her perfume still lingered in the air, sharp, foreign, unsettling. I thought of my late husband, of how he had worked for decades to build this house brick by brick. "She doesn't understand yet," I whispered to myself. The clock ticked softly on the wall, counting down to something I could feel but not yet see. That night, I promised myself one thing: I would never raise my voice, but I would make sure she learned what real worth meant. People think revenge means destruction. But the truth? It's often a quiet correction, a balance restored in silence. My daughter-in-law thought she'd outsmart an old woman with pretty words and rich connections. But arrogance fades when faced with truth written in ink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight for approval. I simply let the law speak the language she understood best. When she finally left my house, she looked smaller somehow, not poorer, just wiser. And that, I suppose, was the point. Because power isn't about having everything, it's about knowing you could lose it all and still smile. That's the kind of wealth she'll never inherit.